In the twilight that followed Cersei's defeat, the Red Keep's corridors buzzed with the quiet stirrings of a new age. Daenerys Targaryen, who had chosen to sit upon a simpler throne rather than the jagged seat forged by her ancestors, spent those first nights awake long past the hour when the city's rubble-clogged streets settled into uneasy stillness. In the chamber she now shared with Jon, she pored over reports of damage, of food shortages, of the wounded that overcrowded makeshift infirmaries. Now and then, her gaze would drift to Jon, who often read through the same stacks of parchment by a flickering candle, or left quietly to walk among the city's people when reading proved too heavy a burden. For both of them, the war's end was the start of a responsibility that felt more daunting than the long night itself. King's Landing reeled from the final battle. Though it had not been razed in the manner some had feared, large swaths near the outer walls lay in smoking ruins. The charred skeletons of scorpions littered the fields outside the gates. Barricades had been toppled or scorched into blackened husks of wood. People who had cowered in cellars or behind battered doors emerged to find the capital in a state of lawlessness, where certain unscrupulous souls took advantage of the power vacuum by looting and threatening the weak. In response, Grey Worm and the Unsullied patrolled the streets with disciplined vigilance, joined by contingents of northern soldiers. Daenerys' instructions were clear: restore order with as little violence as possible, ensure that justice, true justice, ruled. Jon took personal interest in that mission, riding out in the early mornings to see how the soldier patrols were received, how frightened children and anxious parents responded to these once alien warriors in their streets. When people began to recognize him, a hush would fall, then a wave of murmured greetings. Jon was the one who, by rumor and by some official declaration, was king consort to the Targaryen queen. More importantly to them, he was the man who fought the army of the dead. They saw in his drawn face someone who had bled for the living, and though trust came slowly, it came more quickly than it might have for Daenerys alone. Jon lacked the polished aura of a conquering monarch. He was far too somber and unassuming for that, and that humility sat well with the traumatized small folk. Most approached timidly, eyes wide, to ask how they might find bread, shelter, or lost relatives. And Jon would promise, in that steady, quiet way of his, that the new queen would not abandon them. Even so, not all hearts were softened. The city had endured too many cruelties under too many rulers. Some of the older merchants and minor lords spoke in hushed voices of Aerys the Mad King, of the Targaryen tradition of blood and fire. Whispers multiplied in taverns and street corners, that Daenerys was a dragon queen just waiting for an excuse to scour the city with flames, that she would take revenge for old betrayals, that one day she might wake mad as her father had, and if that day came, no one would be safe. Jon heard these rumors whenever he walked incognito through the back alleys and markets. He did not lash out. Instead, he tried to address those fears by actions and not just words. Soldiers who terrorized citizens were punished. Thieves who preyed on the helpless were apprehended, but with a fair hearing rather than summary execution. Step by step, Daenerys and Jon sought to prove that the new regime would not be built on terror. Among those who worked hardest to repair the city was Tyrion Lannister, quietly mourning his sister even as he recognized the monstrous deeds she had done. As Hand of the Queen, he was everywhere, organizing caravans of food and supplies from the local farmland, recruiting stable hands and carpenters to clear debris, seeing to it that the city's sewage system, compromised by the fighting, was returned to working order. Varys, for his part, glided in the background, dispatching little birds to sniff out would-be insurgents or leftover pockets of armed men who might sabotage the fragile peace. Tyrion stood at the center of a web of logistics, with Gendry Baratheon on one side overseeing shipments from the Stormlands, and Davos Seaworth on the other advising on naval trade routes for timely deliveries into the city. There was too much work for any single person, and exhaustion showed in every line of Tyrion's face. But he pressed on, determined to be the voice of reason that might hold the realm's fractured pieces together. Only a week after Cersei's death, the Lannister gold cloaks that had once patrolled the streets were effectively disbanded. Many had thrown down their arms when the city fell, and those who stubbornly persisted with pockets of resistance found themselves outmaneuvered by the Unsullied. Daenerys, after consulting with Jon, Tyrion, and the rest of the council, declared that a new city watch would be formed, one that would answer not merely to the queen but to the law itself. Davos helped lay the groundwork, drawing from his old smuggler's instincts and his sense of fairness alike, while Grey Worm vetted each candidate for discipline and loyalty to a united realm rather than a single noble house. In a sense, it was the first step in the dream of breaking the cycle of noble families using royal institutions for personal power. If the city's reorganization went relatively smoothly, the same could not be said of the broader realm. Ravens flitted across every corner of Westeros, carrying news of Cersei's demise, the ascension of Queen Daenerys, and the contested matter of Jon Snow's Targaryen blood. In the north, Sansa Stark remained in Winterfell as Warden of the North, rebuilding the snow-swept castle walls, seeing to the safety of her people. As the spring began to creep across the land, though it was a fragile spring, still rhymed with late frosts, fields and livestock demanded attention. House Glover, House Serwyn, and the rest, once fiercely independent, now wondered whether they had traded subservience to the Iron Throne for subservience to a Targaryen once more. But Jon's presence in the new royal court reassured them somewhat. He was their own, Ned Stark's son for all they cared, and they trusted that he would not let the North be ground under the wheel of southern politics. In the Vale, Sweet Robin, Lord of the Eyrie, was still a youth, easily swayed by his regents. Little danger emerged from that quarter, though there was tension about how the new monarchy would manage the Vale's unique isolation. The Riverlands, battered by war after war, mostly fell in line out of sheer exhaustion. House Tully, with Edmure Tully recovered from captivity, voiced cautious support for the new queen, especially since Daenerys had not devastated the capital in the way some had feared. The Stormlands followed Gendry Baratheon's example, in partial loyalty if only for the sake of re-establishing stability. The Reach was a patchwork, with some lords still bitter that Highgarden had been taken by the Lannisters in the previous conflict. Many of those men had died, leaving younger heirs to navigate uncertain waters. Yet once it became clear that Jon and Daenerys had no intention of stripping the Reach of its wealth, talk of reconciliation began to flicker. The Iron Islands presented another challenge. Yara Greyjoy had seized control after Euron's downfall, though scattered reavers still prowled the seas. She harbored no love for the old Iron Throne, but neither did she wish to provoke a direct war with dragons capable of incinerating her ships. Instead, she sent a delegation to King's Landing, politely insisting on some measure of independence for the Ironborn. When that delegation arrived, Daenerys and Jon consulted Tyrion, Davos, and Varys on how best to handle it. With the kingdom so fragile, losing the Iron Islands entirely might encourage other regions to break away. On the other hand, forcing the Ironborn into subjugation risked a fresh rebellion. After heated discussions, they decided on a compromise. The Iron Islands would remain under the crown, but Yara would be permitted wide latitude in self-governance, provided she did not conduct further raids on the mainland. They wrote it into a formal agreement sealed with the royal seal, a deft piece of diplomacy that might buy peace in the short term. Dorne, ever distant, had simmered in near independence for much of the conflict with the dead. The new prince or princess of Dorne, ruling from Sunspear, was rumored to be an older cousin of the late Prince Doran Martell. This new ruler had not openly declared for or against Daenerys. But after Cersei's fall, a cautious envoy rode north to King's Landing, bearing the sigil of a sun and spear upon golden cloth. The envoy, a slender man with a deep tan and a courteous demeanor, requested an audience with the queen to ascertain her intentions. Daenerys met him in the throne room that still smelled faintly of smoke and blood. She greeted him politely and listened to his concerns. That Dorne had always valued its independence, that its people wanted no more war, and that they remembered all too well the savage death of Elia Martell at the hands of the Lannisters. Daenerys, mindful of her heritage and the atrocities committed upon the Martells in Robert's rebellion, promised that the new reign would not be built on further subjugation. Instead, she offered the envoy a place on her council, representing Dorne's interests directly. The man bowed, hesitating only momentarily before accepting. Once again, the seeds of a more inclusive rule were sown. Yet if outward gestures of peace spread across the 7 kingdoms, inward challenges emerged that tested the precarious unity. Chief among these were the remnants of the old guard, minor Lannister loyalists, hedge knights once sworn to House Frey or House Bolton, mercenaries left stranded when the Golden Company collapsed. These scattered elements nursed grievances and resentments, occasionally attacking supply lines on the roads, leading to King's Landing or sowing rumors in local taverns. In response, Jon sent out carefully selected squads of soldiers, half from the north, half from the Unsullied or Dothraki, to bring these troublemakers to heel. He insisted on trials rather than summary executions. While this approach rankled some who believed that swift brutality would quell dissent, Daenerys supported Jon's stance. She remembered the vow she had made to be more than a conqueror, to break the wheel rather than spin it anew. Amid all these responsibilities, there was still the matter of what to do with the Iron Throne itself. Daenerys had refused to sit on it, thereby sparking a mixture of confusion and awe among the courtiers. Some whispered she was trying to appear humble, while others speculated she meant to melt it down. And indeed, she found herself hovering at that decision, recalling the haunting visions from the House of the Undying. The throne, that monstrous seat forged by Aegon the Conqueror, might always be a symbol of fear and tyranny. She asked Jon what he thought. Late at night, as they lay side by side in the quiet that followed a day's unrelenting tasks, he would consider his words carefully. If the Iron Throne remains, it reminds everyone of the old ways, he said softly, sometimes running a hand through her silver hair as he spoke. Of conquest, of Targaryen might. That can be useful. Some fear keeps ambitious lords in line. But if we're building something better, perhaps fear should not be the bedrock. His gray eyes flickered with concern. You've already placed yourself on a simpler throne for official occasions. The Iron Throne sits unused, but it's still here, overshadowing everything. I don't envy your choice. She would nod, thoughtful. Fear was my weapon once. In Slaver's Bay, fear made the slave masters tremble. But it was hope, too, hope that drew the freed slaves to my side. I wonder if I can keep both, or if it's time to let one go. He would brush a thumb over her cheek. Whatever you decide, I'll stand by you. Their talks continued in the nights that followed. Daenerys consulted Tyrion as well, who had a practical view. Melting it down might alienate some of the old lords who still revere the Targaryen legacy, he reasoned. Leaving it in the throne room might be a constant reminder of the past you're trying to move beyond. Perhaps repurposing it, placing it somewhere symbolic, might strike a balance. He paused, swirling the wine in his cup. Though as your hand, I can't deny the dramatic flair of melting it down with dragonfire. It would certainly make a statement. Daenerys only sighed, aware that every symbol, every action, would be dissected by the realm's watchful eyes. For the moment, she let the Iron Throne remain where it was, dust collecting on its twisted edges, as if waiting for the day she made a final decision. Meanwhile, the small council that governed day-to-day matters began to take shape. Tyrion remained Hand of the Queen. Davos, valued for both his moral compass and practical sense, acted as Master of Ships, though he openly admitted that the intricacies of shipbuilding and fleets might sometimes escape him. Gendry Baratheon took on the role of Master of Laws to help restructure the cities, and eventually the realms, legal codes in a way that served more than the nobility. Varys continued as Master of Whispers, a role that needed little explanation. Grey Worm, initially uncertain if he should remain in Westeros or sail away to carry on Missandei's dream of returning to Noth, ultimately chose to become the commander of the royal forces, bridging the Unsullied with the northern armies. Missandei, her faith in Daenerys unbroken despite the horrors they had all witnessed, stayed on as a chief advisor and translator for foreign relations, especially as new emissaries from Essos arrived to see whether the Dragon Queen might invest in trade or alliances across the sea. Jon, for his part, was not officially assigned a specific seat on this council. He was king consort, a presence that could neither be ignored nor fully codified in the typical structure. He sat in on their meetings but often left the details to men and women more adept at the realm's political intricacies. Where Jon excelled was in the intangible realm of uniting hearts, speaking to people from the lowest station to the highest and imparting a sense of calm sincerity. He spent many hours walking the city, listening to those who had no titles or coins. In the evenings, he would return, a quiet figure in dusty clothes, to share with Daenerys what he had learned. That orphans filled the streets, that wells in Flea Bottom needed refurbishing, that certain unscrupulous lords had been harassing farmers on the outskirts of the Crownlands. Daenerys used that information in her edicts, forging a direct line of empathy between the monarchy and its subjects. It was not all hardship, though. Glimpses of hope surfaced. Street musicians reappeared, timidly at first. A few traveling merchants set up carts along the main thoroughfares, braving the rubble to hawk colorful spices or trinkets. Children began to play again, sometimes chasing each other around the broken stones of King's Landing's lesser squares. A small, makeshift sept was erected for the Faith of the Seven, where charitable septons and septas distributed bread and soup. The city was wounded, but it was alive. More than once, Daenerys and Jon encountered gatherings of commoners singing ballads of the Long Night's End or telling stories of how a young girl named Arya Stark had killed the Night King. Rumors and legends entwined until the truth was half obscured by a swirl of myth, but the essence remained. The Great War was over, the living had won, and now there was a chance for a future that wasn't overshadowed by ice or tyranny. And yet Arya Stark herself was rarely seen in the city. She came and went, quick as a ghost, sometimes to join the small council if she believed her insight was needed, sometimes simply to watch from a distance. After the war, she had told her siblings that she would never be a lady or a courtier, that she yearned for something else. She had lingered longer than she intended, partly to see her brother wed to Daenerys, partly to ensure that Cersei truly met her end. But now that the realm was shifting into a peacetime mode, she felt the edges of her old restless hunger. The wide world beckoned, or so she confided to Jon one afternoon, when they walked through the shell of a burned temple near the city's outskirts. He tried to speak of the realm's need for people like her, cunning and capable, but she only shook her head. She had a life to live, she said, and it wasn't one of politics. They embraced, promising that if she ever needed a safe haven, Winterfell or King's Landing would always welcome her. A week later, Arya was gone, leaving only a note for Sansa that she was heading west, to see whatever lay beyond the horizon. Jon, for all his worry, understood that such was her nature. She was no caged wolf. Sansa Stark, on the other hand, expanded her governance in the north with a firm, measured hand. Through ravens sent back and forth, she and Daenerys coordinated trade routes that would allow the north to receive shipments of grain and other supplies it desperately needed after the devastation of the Night King's march. In return, the north offered timber and ore from its mountains, as well as the promise of a standing force if any new threat should arise. Though Sansa was cautious, perhaps never fully comfortable with Daenerys' Targaryen name or the stories that lingered, she recognized the necessity of cooperation. Their letters were polite, at times even cordial, carrying mutual respect that was once absent. Occasionally, Sansa sent envoys who looked over the city's progress, shook their heads at the southern climb, and then returned north with detailed accounts. Even the suspicious lords found themselves grudgingly admitting that Daenerys' rule, in conjunction with Jon's presence, was not the tyranny they had anticipated. As the capital labored to patch its wounds, Daenerys turned her gaze to a broader horizon. She remembered her conquests in Slaver's Bay, how she had left some measure of stability there but not absolute security. She asked Missandei to write letters to old allies across the narrow sea, ensuring that the slavers had not regained power in her absence. Occasionally, battered ships carrying freedmen arrived at King's Landing, seeking the queen they called Mysa. She welcomed them with what resources she could spare, but told them gently that she had to focus on the realm she now ruled. Still, she was determined to send a fleet of emissaries one day, led perhaps by Missandei or Grey Worm, to ensure that her eastern victories had not been undone. For the moment, though, she was bound to Westeros. The people of King's Landing depended on her presence, and she would not abandon them. In the midst of these administrative labors, small but significant moments of grace brightened Daenerys' life with Jon. They had married so quickly, amid the ashes of Winterfell, that the concept of a proper wedding feast or joyous celebrations had never been realized. Now, sometimes in the evenings, they found stolen pockets of peace where they might share a meal alone, or walk through the Red Keep's damaged but still grand gardens. They would talk of simpler things. The way Ghost, Jon's direwolf, prowled the corridors at night, startling unsuspecting guards. The sweetness of early spring cherries sold by a Dornish merchant near the city gates. The memory of Grey Worm and Missandei shyly sharing smiles during morning drills. Daenerys would rest her head on Jon's shoulder, letting the day's tension melt away for just a little while, though the realm had not yet embraced them wholeheartedly. Too many scars needed healing. It was enough for them to know they had each other, that their love, forged in battle, had endured. Yet no reign can stay free of crises for long, and the next threat to the fragile peace came not from the outside, but from within. In the gloom of the city's slums, a self-styled prophet began preaching that the Targaryens were demons returned. This figure, a gaunt man in a tattered robe, rallied the desperate and the broken with tales of old Targaryen atrocities, weaving them with prophecies of doom. He called himself the Shepherd, reminiscent of that madman who once incited riots in King's Landing's past. His followers gathered in hidden corners, fed by hopelessness and hunger. At first, the city watch dismissed him as a lunatic. But then riots began to break out in the poorer districts. Fires were set. Unsullied patrols were ambushed. A handful of northern soldiers were found dead in an alley, their throats cut with unsettling precision. Graffiti scrawled on battered walls read, "No more dragons, remember the Mad King, and death to Targaryens." Tyrion grew concerned enough to bring the matter to Daenerys at a private council. The queen listened, her face drawn with fatigue. "We can't allow these riots to spread," she said firmly. "But if we come down too harshly, we prove their accusations of tyranny." Tyrion nodded. "Exactly. These rabble-rousers thrive on being oppressed, turning themselves into martyrs. If we attempt to crush them openly, we risk turning the common folk against you. We need a subtler solution, or at least a balanced one." Grey Worm, standing near the war table, offered a quiet suggestion. "We could infiltrate them, learn who leads them besides this so-called prophet. Arrest the ringleaders quietly." Varys, hands folded in his voluminous sleeves, spoke up. "I have my little birds among their ranks already. The trouble is that the shepherd's strength isn't in a well-organized conspiracy. It's in the fear and desperation of the people. Cut off his head, and a new voice might arise, unless we address what truly ails them. Hunger, disease, squalid living conditions." Daenerys turned to Jon. "You've walked those streets more than I have," she said. "What do you think?" Jon hesitated, recalling the gaunt faces and angry eyes he'd seen in Flea Bottom. "They're frightened," he said at last. "They expected that once Cersei fell, life would be easier. But for many, it's as hard as ever. Food is still scarce. Coin is scarcer. You can't repair an entire city in a matter of weeks. The shepherd gives them someone to blame. If we want to undermine him, we need to bring immediate relief. Show that the crown actually cares about them." Daenerys steeled her gaze. "Then we do both. We bring relief and we locate this shepherd. If he preaches violence, we stop him before more innocents die." She glanced at Tyrion. "Find a way to distribute more grain, even if we have to buy it at a premium from the Reach. Open more soup kitchens. Increase pay for workers clearing rubble so that they can feed their families. Let them see that our reign is not indifferent." Tyrion scratched at his trimmed beard. "It won't be cheap, Your Grace. The crown's coffers are not overflowing." Jon spoke up. "House Stark will lend what it can, though our own resources are not vast." Tyrion acknowledged this with a nod. "It might be enough to keep the city afloat a while longer. Meanwhile, I'll work with Varys to see how we can flush out this prophet without feeding his legend." Thus began an intense push to stabilize the capital from within. Convoys of grain arrived from Highgarden, at a cost that made Tyrion's face blanch, but Daenerys insisted. Soup kitchens were established in the neighborhoods hardest hit by the fighting, staffed by volunteers from the faith who believed in the new queen's vow to protect the innocent. Jon quietly oversaw the disbursement, ensuring that no unscrupulous official siphoned off supplies for profit. Grey Worm increased patrols but instructed his soldiers to be gentle unless faced with genuine violence. Flyers were posted at street corners, proclaiming that the Queen would host open audiences on certain days, inviting petitions directly from the smallfolk. The measure had an effect. The shepherd's hold on the desperate began to waver, as more people found daily bread and safer streets. But the riots did not cease entirely. The prophet and his most fervent followers moved in the shadows, attacking crown officials or setting ablaze warehouses in an attempt to sabotage the relief efforts. By night, the City Watch discovered sinister gatherings, complete with ranting sermons about how the Dragon Queen would bring doom upon them all. Varys's little birds reported that some of these zealots also sought to kill Jon, whom they called the Betrayer of the North, a reference to the old rumor that he was not merely a Stark but a Targaryen by blood. Whether out of misguided superstition or malignant cunning, they believed removing both dragons would save the realm. Finally, after weeks of cat and mouse, Varys located the shepherd's stronghold in the tunnels beneath an abandoned foundry in Flea Bottom. Tyrion brought the intelligence to Daenerys, who met with Jon, Grey Worm, and a handful of trusted soldiers. Under cover of night, they entered the labyrinth of tunnels, humid, foul-smelling corridors that once served as drainage systems for the city's foundries. Their torches flickered across rusted machinery and puddles of stagnant water. Rats scurried in the shadows. Jon led the way, Longclaw at his hip, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Grey Worm and a small squad of Unsullied followed, each armed with short spears and knives. Tyrion and Varys stayed behind, waiting near the surface to coordinate reinforcements if needed. Daenerys, determined not to be sheltered away, had come as well, despite Jon's protestations. She wore simple leather armor and carried a dagger at her belt. The presence of a queen in such a dangerous mission made Grey Worm anxious, but Daenerys would not be dissuaded. They advanced slowly, following a half-rotten wooden walkway toward the deeper recesses. The stench grew stronger. Then, in the glow of Jon's torch, they saw flickering lights in the distance. Candles or lamps arranged in a circle. Low chanting rose, echoing off the damp walls. The group paused. Daenerys locked eyes with Jon, and he nodded. She steeled herself and advanced. In the center of a wide chamber stood a ragged cluster of men and women, huddled around a tall, emaciated figure. The shepherd wore tattered cloth that barely covered his gaunt body. His eyes, fever-bright, shone in the half-light. Around him, a half-dozen armed zealots stood guard, twitchy with tension. At the sight of Daenerys and her escort, the chanting ceased abruptly. A hush descended, broken only by the drip of water and the shuffle of boots. The shepherd raised an arm, bony fingers pointing at Daenerys. "Behold, the dragon's whore, who claims mercy but brings only flame." His voice resonated in the enclosed space with eerie force. She would brand the world with her fire, as her forebears did. Ares burned men alive in these very streets. Daenerys swallowed her anger, took a step forward. "I am Daenerys Targaryen, and I have not come to burn you. I have come to stop the violence you spread in my city. You claim to speak for the people, yet you lead them to slaughter." An uneasy murmur rippled among the shepherd's followers. Many of them looked frightened, not fanatical, as though they had been swept up by desperation. The shepherd's gaze flickered over Jon and Grey Worm's squad, and then settled back on Daenerys with something akin to hateful glee. "You come in the dark to murder us, to silence the truth that the Targaryen line is cursed. You played the savior once, but soon your father's madness will claim you, or your dragons will set this city aflame. And this man, the so-called Stark, is your corrupt puppet, tainted by your vile blood." Jon stepped closer, his torch casting flickering shadows on the shepherd's gaunt face. "We've offered the city food, safety, and a chance to rebuild," he said quietly. "What have you offered, besides fear?" The shepherd spat at the ground. "I offer them salvation from your lies. I offer them redemption from bending the knee to false kings and queens." He gestured wildly at the crowd behind him. "These souls see the truth, that the world will never know peace under a Targaryen's rule. Even if you kill me, the people will rise. Daenerys drew in a steadying breath. She thought of her father's cruelty, of her vow never to become a tyrant. She spoke softly but clearly. People will rise when they are oppressed and starving. But I do not oppress them, nor do I wish to see them starve. Your fires and murders help no one. Look at the world outside these tunnels. People have bread for the first time in weeks. Children have roofs over their heads. What do you offer them here, in the dark? His eyes narrowed, and for a heartbeat, it seemed something akin to doubt flickered there. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by a twisted resolve. You will lead them to ruin, he hissed. We are the last guardians of truth, and we will purge your corruption with flame if we must. He snapped his fingers. One of his zealots hefted a crude clay pot, lit with a makeshift fuse. Jon recognized the threat: wildfire, or at the very least, some rudimentary bomb. Grey Worm reacted in a flash. He lunged forward, spear lashing out. The zealot stumbled, the pot dropped, and the fuse sizzled. Jon shouted for everyone to back away. Daenerys darted behind a broken column, Grey Worm grabbing her arm to shield her. The pot exploded in a deafening roar, sending shards of clay and burning liquid across the chamber. Screams erupted. Half the shepherd's followers scattered, some ignited by the flames. 2 unsullied fell, one writhing in agony. The walls glowed greenish for an instant if it was indeed wildfire, or at least some potent incendiary. Smoke filled the air. Jon coughed, wiping soot from his eyes. Through the haze, he saw the shepherd retreating deeper into a side passage, a handful of zealots with him, while others lay on the ground, groaning or worse. Grey Worm signaled to his men, who fanned out, ignoring the smoke to secure the perimeter. Daenerys stepped into the circle of half-burned floor, glancing in horror at the wounded. Some of the shepherd's followers who had survived the blast cowered, no longer chanting, simply terrified. Jon joined her, placing a hand on her shoulder. He's running, Jon muttered. Grey Worm will chase him. But Daenerys saw the flicker of the shepherd's robe as he vanished into the darkness of another tunnel. Her eyes narrowed. If he escapes, he'll incite more violence, she said. I won't let him keep turning the desperate against us. Jon, come. Together they pursued. Grey Worm had beaten them to the mouth of the tunnel, thrusting a spear at a zealot who blocked his way. The man went down, clutching his stomach. Grey Worm kicked him aside and motioned for Daenerys and Jon to stay behind him, but Daenerys pressed forward. The passage twisted, the air thick with acrid fumes. They moved carefully, torches held high, the flickering flames revealing a warren of side passages. Every few steps, they heard the sound of frantic footsteps ahead, echoing in frantic bursts. The stench grew worse. They passed a cluster of rats fleeing in the opposite direction. Then the tunnel opened into a wide cistern chamber. The shepherd stood on a stone ledge, panting, chest heaving. In one hand, he gripped a torch. Below him, a pool of stagnant water shimmered in the faint torchlight. On the far side, a collapsed archway led to the city's labyrinth beneath the great September's ruins. Jon guessed that if the shepherd escaped that way, he might vanish among the catacombs. Stay back, the shepherd rasped, waving his torch. I'll burn this whole place if I must. The city shall drown in green fire. Daenerys scanned the chamber. Indeed, she saw faint greenish stains along the walls, residual wildfire from a stash perhaps left behind by Cersei or even the Mad King's older caches. If the shepherd ignited it, the entire area might erupt and potentially collapse half the district above. Her heart pounded. Slowly, she raised her hands, palms out. There's no need for more blood, she said, her voice echoing. Blood is all the dragon knows, he snarled. He took a step back, misjudging his footing on the ledge. A chunk of stone crumbled, and he nearly lost his balance. The torch dipped dangerously close to the water. You think you can build a better world on lies? We will not kneel. Grey Worm and Jon edged forward, careful not to spook him into hurling the torch. Daenerys also stepped onto the ledge, her boots scraping on the slick stone. The shepherd's eyes darted to her with wild hatred. "Back, or we all die here." Jon's voice was taut. "If you ignite the wildfire, it's not just us, it's innocent people above. That's not righteous. That's murder. Is that the redemption you promised?" A flicker of doubt seemed to cross the shepherd's face. He hesitated, turning his head as if he could hear the screams of innocence. For a fleeting moment, Daenerys thought he might set the torch aside. But then his gaze settled on her once more, and the madness returned. "Better they die free of the dragon's shadow," he whispered. He hurled the torch downward. Grey Worm sprang forward, spear extended, aiming to strike it aside. His reflexes were honed from years of training, but the angle was awkward, the distance too great. The torch spun in the air, trailing sparks. Jon let out a shout, lunging forward. Daenerys saw the greenish residue on the floor below. She felt a surge of horror, but the torch landed in the stagnant water with a hiss, missing the puddle of wildfire by a narrow margin. Steam and smoke billowed. The shepherd cursed. Grey Worm rushed him, but the man dodged, slashing with a small dagger. The blade glanced off Grey Worm's armor, and in the next instant, Jon tackled the shepherd from the side, sending them both sprawling on the slick ledge. They teetered near the edge. The shepherd snarled, trying to plunge his dagger into Jon's side. But Jon caught the man's wrist, straining with all his might. Daenerys moved to help, only to see the shepherd's foot slip. They all went over the edge in a tangle of limbs. Grey Worm managed to catch Daenerys' arm, keeping her from falling. Jon and the shepherd toppled into the murky water below, vanishing beneath the surface. A swirl of bubbles emerged as they struggled. Daenerys, breath tight, wrenched her arm free from Grey Worm and dropped into the water. The shock of the cold and the foul stench nearly overwhelmed her. She opened her eyes, seeing only darkness. Her hands flailed, searching for Jon. At last, her fingers brushed against cloth and hair. She pulled, adrenaline surging. The shepherd thrashed nearby, gurgling. Jon surfaced with a gasp, water streaming from his hair. The shepherd reappeared moments later, coughing and sputtering, dagger still clutched in his hand. Daenerys attempted to reach for Jon, but the shepherd lunged, wild. His blade flashed in the torchlight from above. Jon twisted aside, driving an elbow into the shepherd's sternum. The dagger fell from the zealot's grasp, plopping into the water. The shepherd choked on a mouthful of sewage and tried to grab Jon's neck in a desperation hold. Daenerys, half-blinded by filth, swam closer, hooking an arm under the shepherd's left elbow and wrenching it backward. She put all her force into the maneuver, ignoring the revulsion. The man yelped, losing his grip on Jon, who drew a deep breath of air. Grey Worm's voice echoed above. "Your Grace, take my spear." The tip of his weapon jutted down from the ledge, a makeshift handhold. Jon grabbed Daenerys by the waist, guiding her toward the spear. She reached out, slipped once, then managed to grip the wooden shaft. Grey Worm pulled with surprising strength, hauling Daenerys up until she could scramble onto a half-submerged rock. Jon followed, half lifting her with him, both of them coughing. The shepherd, still in the water, struggled to keep afloat, cursing them. As soon as Jon had enough balance to turn around, he saw the zealot trying to climb onto another chunk of collapsed masonry. The man's eyes were wild, spittle and water flying from his lips. "You'll kill us all," he shrieked, voice ragged. "Madness and flame is all you bring." His foot slipped, and he tumbled back into the water. This time, he did not resurface. Whether he was dragged under by an undertow or pinned beneath debris, they did not know. Jon and Daenerys listened to the echo of his frantic splashing fade into silence. Grey Worm leapt down carefully, searching for the man in the shallows, but only swirling blackness remained. When it was over, they climbed the ledge, dripping and exhausted, battered by the narrow escape. Torches glimmered in the hands of unsullied soldiers who arrived at last, having subdued the rest of the zealots. Daenerys's hair hung limp, streaked with foul water. Jon's clothes dripped a steady trickle that formed muddy puddles on the floor. Grey Worm bowed his head. "Your Grace, are you hurt?" Daenerys shook her head, though her heart pounded in her ears. "No, Jon." He coughed, shaking his head as well. "I'm alive. That was too close." Together, they made their way back through the tunnels, supporting each other with arms around shoulders. The flicker of torches illuminated the carnage from the explosion. Injured zealots moaning, the remains of the Unsullied who had been caught in the blast. A few members of the city watch arrived with stretchers, carting off the wounded. As they emerged into the night air of Flea Bottom's ruins, Tyrion and Varys hurried over, their expressions a mixture of relief and concern. Tyrion wrinkled his nose at the smell emanating from the sopping wet monarchs. "That looks even less pleasant than it smells," he remarked, though his voice was tight with worry. Jon forced a half-grin, though he still trembled from the adrenaline. "We're alive. The shepherd isn't." Varys's gaze flicked to the tunnel. "So it's done, then?" Daenerys swayed slightly, catching Jon's arm to steady herself. "We'll see. He drowned in that cistern, or so it seems. Some of his zealots remain, but without him, they'll lack direction." She took a deep breath, the night air almost refreshing despite the stench. "We must see to the wounded, and the city must see that we overcame this threat without turning Flea Bottom into an inferno." Tyrion nodded, the tension in his shoulders easing. "You'll need a healer's attention, and a good, long bath." He glanced at Daenerys's grimy face, and then at Jon's. "You both do." That night, or rather the early hours of the morning, found Daenerys and Jon returning to the Red Keep, escorted by Grey Worm's guards. The rest of the day passed in a haze. They bathed, changed into clean garments, and found themselves in the castle infirmary being inspected for cuts or infections. Missandei hovered anxiously, pressing a warm cup of herbal tea into Daenerys's hands. Jon grimaced at the pungent smell but drank anyway, knowing it would help stave off any disease from the foul water. Only after the healers assured them there were no grave wounds did they finally retire to their chambers, collapsing onto the bed in a mutual state of utter exhaustion. The next morning's sun rose on a calmer city. Word of the shepherd's downfall had spread through the slums. Rumors circulated that the queen herself had ventured into the depths to stop him, that the king consort had fought side by side with her, that they risked their own lives to prevent a catastrophe of green fire. Small folk who once whispered about Targaryen cruelty found themselves recounting tales of a queen who had personally intervened to keep them safe. The immediate riots ceased. Some zealots disbanded. Others were captured by the city watch. Flea Bottom was still destitute, still riddled with sorrow, but at least one spark of mayhem had been doused. In the quiet that followed, Daenerys and Jon continued their work of rebuilding. Weeks turned into months. The city grew steadily safer and more orderly. Food became more plentiful as the new harvests arrived, and caravans from the north and the Reach streamed in. Roads were cleared, watchtowers reoccupied, small councils held. With each day, the monarchy's presence felt less like a foreign occupation and more like a legitimate rule, though distrust persisted in some quarters. Winter receded, giving way to an uncertain spring, the smell of thawing earth mixing with the brine of Blackwater Bay. Yet beneath the veneer of progress, deeper questions loomed. How exactly would Daenerys govern the Seven Kingdoms? Would she hold them all in a single grip, as her ancestors did, or would she grant them each a measure of autonomy? What of the North's centuries-old desire for independence, which had flared into open rebellion once before? Jon walked a delicate line. He had pledged himself to Daenerys, but he also understood the North's fierce pride. That tension weighed on him late at night when he read letters from Sansa, who sometimes politely pushed for more freedoms, more recognition of northern self-rule. Daenerys, for her part, wrestled with the knowledge that her ancestors had unified Westeros by force. She wished to rule not by terror, but by a unity that endured because it was freely chosen. And yet, if every region decided to go its own way, would that shatter the fragile peace they had bought with so much blood? At last, after many conversations and counsel from Tyrion, Daenerys summoned the great lords of Westeros to King's Landing for a grand assembly. Some arrived quickly, those nearest in the Crownlands, the Stormlands, and the Reach. Others, from the north or Dorne, took longer, traveling in guarded retinues along roads still dotted with hazards. In time, the Red Keep's once-scarred courtyard bustled with knights, bannermen, and servants wearing a kaleidoscope of sigils. The flayed man of House Bolton was long absent, replaced by the Wolf of Stark, the Golden Rose of Tyrell. Though that house was nearly extinct, lesser branches carried on. The Sun and Spear of Martell, the Falcon of Arryn, the Trout of Tully, the Kraken of Greyjoy, the Lion of Lannister, though that last was smaller in number, mostly distant cousins or lesser lords, for the main line was shattered. The day the assembly began, the throne room was filled to capacity. Sunlight streamed through the high windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. Daenerys waited at the far end, seated not on the iron throne but on her simpler seat of polished wood and gold trim. Jon stood at her side, wearing a dark gray cloak pinned with the Stark direwolf, a subtle Targaryen dragon emblem added in silver on the opposite side. Tyrion, Davos, Grey Worm, Varys, Missandei, and Gendry stood nearby as the official small council. Gathered below were the lords and ladies, some wearing finery, others sporting the rugged, fur-lined attire of the north. A hush settled. Daenerys rose, voice carrying across the hall. Lords and ladies of Westeros, we stand in a new era, one where the undead threat has passed, one where the tyrant who sat the Iron Throne has been removed. You answered my call to come here so we might shape the future of these 7 kingdoms together. She paused, scanning the assembly. I do not want to rule by fear. That was the way of my father, and it ended in madness. Nor do I wish to see Westeros torn apart by endless feuds, each kingdom turning upon the other. Therefore, I propose we begin a new council, one that gives each region a voice in the governance of the realm. Let us work together to rebuild, to ensure that no single family can again plunge us into war unopposed. She continued, explaining how she envisioned a system where each great region would send representatives to a central council. This body would have the authority to advise the crown, pass laws beneficial to the realm as a whole, and check any potential overreach. The monarchy would remain with Daenerys and her heirs, should she have any, at its head, but the great lords would have a formal say in matters of state. She drew inspiration from the traditions of old Valyria. Before the Doom, some local governance and councils had existed, and from the lessons she learned in Meereen, where she had established councils of freedmen and former slavers. The gathered lords muttered among themselves. Some seemed intrigued by the possibility of having their voices heard at a higher level. Others bristled, unwilling to yield any portion of their ancient rights to a newfangled council. Yet, after so many years of war and devastation, most recognized that the old ways had brought only conflict. If the Queen's proposal might avert another Targaryen versus Lannister bloodbath, or another North versus South revolt, it was worth considering. Sansa Stark, arrived from Winterfell, stepped forward. She was clothed in a gown of thick gray cloth, the Stark direwolf embroidered in pale silver thread at the sleeves. Jon's expression softened upon seeing her. Daenerys watched with careful attention. Sansa inclined her head. I speak for the North, she said, voice echoing in the throne room. We have bled and suffered to keep the realm safe from the dead. We have our traditions, our ways. In the past, we have sought to be free of Southern rule. But my brother stands at your side, your grace, and I can see that you have done much to heal the city. I will hear your proposals with an open mind. But I ask one thing, that the North be granted a measure of autonomy that reflects our unique land and culture. We do not wish to be forced into decisions that harm our people or break our faith with the old gods. Daenerys listened intently. Though she recalled tension with Sansa in Winterfell, she heard only a measured request now. You shall have it, Daenerys replied, voice calm. If the North requires distinct laws to govern itself, provided they do not contradict the fundamental laws of the realm, then the North shall have that freedom. In turn, I ask that you pledge not to break away, that you remain part of this new alliance for the betterment of all. Sansa inclined her head again, Not a full bow, but a gesture of agreement. "That seems fair," she said, and the hush in the hall relaxed into faint murmurs. Jon allowed himself a quiet exhalation. This was as good a start as any. One by one, the other region's lords came forward. The lords of the Vale, speaking on behalf of the young Lord Aaron, found the idea agreeable, as they preferred peace to any new war. Edmure Tully, representing the Riverlands, spoke earnestly of rebuilding farmland and trade, and found the Queen's plan promising if it brought an end to future tyrannies. The new Princess of Dorne, a regal woman with sharp features who introduced herself as Aeliandra Martell, expressed guarded support, stating that Dorne would never submit to a blind foreign yoke again. But if Daenerys truly meant to share power, Dorne would join in the new era. Lord Yara Greyjoy, newly confirmed in her command of the Iron Islands, demanded independence for her people's culture and traditions at sea, which Daenerys and Tyrion diplomatically navigated, ensuring the Ironborn would remain part of the realm but be granted broad authority over their maritime laws. From the Reach, various lesser lords debated among themselves, uncertain who truly led the region now that House Tyrell was gone. But they tentatively approved the Queen's proposals if it guaranteed the security of trade routes. At last, a thin, stern-faced man wearing a worn lion sigil stepped forward, Laurent Lannister, a distant cousin of Cersei and Jaime. He had survived the war by virtue of staying in the Westerlands, and now he represented what remained of the Lannister line. He bowed curtly. "Your Grace," he began, voice taut. "House Lannister once sat on the Iron Throne. Now we are but remnants. I ask that you allow the Westerlands to rebuild as well. We do not have the wealth we once did, but we pledge that what remains of our gold mines will pay taxes fairly. The days of Lannister arrogance died with Cersei, I hope." Daenerys studied him. She saw lines of worry on his face, recognized that House Lannister was as battered as any other. She inclined her head. "Your submission is accepted. We welcome House Lannister's efforts to rebuild in peace. Let the gold that once fueled wars now fuel prosperity instead." Murmurs of cautious approval rippled through the hall. When all had spoken, Daenerys directed Missandei to note each region's requests and her initial responses. She then proposed that they formalize the creation of a Grand Council, one that would meet every moon's turn, with representatives from each region. Major decisions affecting the entire realm would be debated there, and though the crown would hold a veto, it would be used sparingly, requiring compelling reason. The assembly debated for hours, breaking only for meals and short rest. Tyrion guided them through the rough edges of forming a new governance structure, occasionally leaning on Davos or Gendry for their viewpoints on fairness and law. By the assembly's end, a tentative agreement had been forged, signed or verbally affirmed by the region's delegates. Though cynics muttered that it would never last, or that eventually another war would break out, there was, in that moment, a palpable sense of relief among those gathered. They had fought too long, lost too many. If Daenerys Targaryen, breaker of chains, truly meant to share power, perhaps they could avoid further carnage. The cynics, at least, had no better alternative to present. The day concluded with a feast. For once, the great hall rang with more than the clash of arms or the hush of conspiratorial whispering. Tables were laid with roasted meats, vegetables from the new harvest, and casks of wine from the arbor. Musicians played tunes reminiscent of older, happier times. Lords who had once faced each other on battlefields now shared wary toasts. Sansa sat at a table with Edmure Tully, exchanging updates about Winterfell and Riverrun. Yara Greyjoy and Aeliandra Martell tried to outdo each other with tales of daring. Lord Laurent Lannister spoke quietly with Tyrion, perhaps seeking some measure of familial connection. At the high table, Daenerys, flanked by Jon and the small council, spoke politely with whoever approached, sometimes smiling, sometimes sober. She did not wear a crown that night, though she wore a cloak embroidered with the three-headed dragon in shimmering thread. Jon likewise eschewed a regal circlet. They were, they explained, a queen and king consort who wished to stand with their lords, not above them. Some called it a wise gesture. Others saw it as naive. But the atmosphere remained celebratory. Late in the evening, when the feast had dwindled to smaller clusters of tired merrymakers, Daenerys and Jon slipped away into one of the Red Keep's lesser gardens. It was newly replanted, some of the flower beds still bare where the old soil had been scorched. A few lanterns glowed softly, revealing the silhouettes of hedges and a stone bench. The sky above was clear, studded with stars. Daenerys pulled her cloak around her shoulders, the mild chill of the night brushing her skin. Jon walked beside her, quietly contemplative. They found the bench and sat, letting the distant hum of the feast fade behind them. After a few moments, she sighed, a sound both weary and content. "We've done so much, but there's still so far to go," she said softly, gazing up at the sky. "Some days I think we're winning them over. Other days, I feel as though we're walking on a knife's edge." Jon reached for her hand, lacing his fingers with hers. "They've seen war after war. I don't blame them for being wary." His gaze shifted to her face, softened by the lantern light. "But you gave them hope tonight, a way forward that doesn't rely on swords and dragons alone." She squeezed his hand. "And you gave them trust. You walked among them, bled among them. You're the reason half of them even listened to me at all." A faint smile curved her lips. "We're not the first Targaryens to take this city, but perhaps we can be the first to truly unite it without destruction." He nodded, thinking back to their harrowing battles against the Night King and Cersei. "When I first traveled south to meet you, I only wanted an alliance to save the North from the dead. I never expected all of this." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Nor did I. I was so certain my life would be all conquest and strife. I never imagined finding solace or family." She paused, then spoke quietly. "Sometimes, I wonder what our children might inherit, if we're given the chance to have them. Will it be a realm at peace? Or will the wheel turn again?" Jon's arms circled her waist, a gesture of comfort. "We can't know what the future holds, but we can do everything in our power to give them a world better than the one we knew." In the hush that followed, they listened to the faint music drifting from the great hall, the soft chirping of insects in the garden, the distant hush of the city. Above, the stars gleamed, cold and eternal. For a moment, Daenerys closed her eyes and remembered visions of the House of the Undying, ash and ruin overlaying the Red Keep. Now, the city still bore scars, but it lived. People laughed, loved, and worked. She had not become a queen of ashes. She hoped that in the end, her reign would be remembered for compassion and unity, not for the horrors that had preceded her. The next months were a slow, painstaking exercise in statecraft, compromise, and ongoing reconstruction. The new Grand Council convened periodically, each region sending 2 or 3 representatives who made their voices heard in the halls of the Red Keep. Arguments were frequent. Lords rarely agreed on matters of tariffs, fishing rights, or border disputes. But the presence of Daenerys as an arbitrator, backed by dragons still circling the skies, and Jon as a moderating influence, allowed them to find middle grounds. Many times, Tyrion or Davos had to use all their political cunning to hammer out solutions that left no side entirely happy but no side entirely aggrieved. It was a system built on mutual discomfort, yet it might hold if only because the alternative, another war, was unthinkable to the exhausted lords. Rhaegal and Drogon hunted freely, their mighty silhouettes once more inspiring both awe and trepidation. Rhaegal's wounds healed slowly, but with careful attention from a handful of brave keepers, he regained strength. Drogon remained fiercely protective of Daenerys, and on more than one occasion, soared across the city's skies, eliciting startled cries from peasants who still feared a repeat of the Dragon Pit's history. Yet Daenerys used the dragons sparingly now, never for raw intimidation. Instead, she sometimes flew them to remote farmland to check for bandits or assist in clearing debris that blocked roads. A single pass of dragonfire could remove a massive boulder from a vital route. Over time, the sight of dragons, once the stuff of nightmares, came to symbolize a new age that combined power with purpose. Other alliances furthered the sense of normalcy. Sansa negotiated an interregional trade agreement with Gendry Baratheon, ensuring that the North's mineral wealth found a ready market in the Stormlands and beyond. Yara Greyjoy collaborated with Davos to improve the crown's naval routes, forging an uneasy partnership between the Ironborn Reavers and the Loyalists who once hunted them. Aleandra Martell oversaw the flow of Dornish wines and spices into King's Landing, fueling commerce that revitalized the capital's markets. Even Laurent Lannister found a niche, pledging shipments of gold to assist in building new city walls. With so many alliances, Daenerys often found her time consumed by signing treaties, greeting envoys, and mediating disputes. It was not glamorous. It was not the sweeping conquest she had once imagined. But it was real, tangible governance, the day-by-day forging of a realm. Still, whispers about Jon's parentage and the Targaryen line persisted. Some lords murmured that if Daenerys died without an heir, Jon would succeed her, carrying the Targaryen name. Others questioned whether they might have children at all. Targaryen marriages had their share of unpredictability. Sansa's supporters in the north sometimes wrote letters to Winterfell, quietly wondering if the realm might eventually be better under a sole northern king. Yet such talk never rose to the level of outright conspiracy, perhaps because none could deny that Daenerys and Jon had proven themselves more interested in mending the realm than dominating it. Eventually, these doubts subsided into background chatter, overshadowed by the daily tasks of living and rebuilding. Each turning of the moon's cycle brought new tasks, new challenges, small wars of words in the council. But the land was healing. With peace came harvests, births, marriages, and slow prosperity. In King's Landing itself, blackened ruins were cleared away, replaced by fresh timber and newly quarried stone. The city would bear scars of the wars for years. Some neighborhoods might never be fully restored, but it was alive, vibrant. Flea Bottom remained poor, but less starved, thanks to ongoing relief efforts. Taxes were restructured, so the small folk were not crushed while the wealthy hoarded coin. Step by step, the old ways were chipped away, replaced by something that, if not perfect, was at least more equitable than before. In time, an air of acceptance settled in. Daenerys was queen. Jon was king consort. The north was a semi-autonomous region that remained loyal, and the other kingdoms found their place in this new mosaic. Dragons soared overhead, but they did not reign with terror. Fewer and fewer men called the queen foreign or conquering. More and more saw her as a monarch who had proven her willingness to fight for them, to bleed for them, and to share power with them. The scars of the past lingered, memories of Aerys, of Robert's rebellion, of the War of the Five Kings. But each day that passed without a new wave of slaughter eased those memories a fraction. Winter truly began to recede, replaced by a mild spring that spread green across the Crownlands and beyond. Jon traveled once more to Winterfell, accompanied by Daenerys, wishing to reconnect with his home and to show the queen what a northern thaw looked like. They arrived by ship at White Harbor, escorted by a contingent of unsullied and northern cavalry. Crowds gathered to witness the queen's arrival, and the sight of her silver hair swirling in the chilly wind sparked hushed awe among the fishermen and dockworkers. Jon, for his part, embraced the Manderleys who welcomed him as if he were still king in the north. Yet they bowed respectfully to Daenerys, offering her salted fish and bread in the northern tradition of guest right. From White Harbor they took the road inland, passing villages that had slowly rebuilt after the horrors of the Night King's invasion. The Stark banners flew alongside Targaryen banners in a sign of unity. Now and then, northern lords would appear, paying respects, exchanging stories of how the snowmelt revealed farmland once again. Daenerys, wrapped in furs, found it both exhilarating and chilly, but she hid her discomfort, determined to show gratitude for their hospitality. Jon teased her gently, recalling how she once marveled at the snows of Winterfell. She teased him back about the dryness of the northern diet, all salted meat and thick stews, though privately she found a charm in the hearty fare. At last they reached Winterfell. The ancient castle stood tall, its walls repaired, though some towers bore visible scars from the siege of the dead. Sansa emerged to greet them in the courtyard, flanked by several lords and ladies. Around them, stable hands bustled to tend the arriving horses. Daenerys dismounted gracefully, ignoring the prickling cold. Sansa inclined her head, a small smile touching her lips. "Queen Daenerys," she said, then turned to Jon. "Brother, welcome home." Jon returned her smile, a warmth in his eyes. "It's good to see you, Sansa." He looked around the courtyard, glimpsing Ghost, his white direwolf, skulking near a stable door. The beast bounded forward, tail high, pressing its muzzle against Jon's hand in greeting. Daenerys reached out tentatively, and Ghost sniffed her palm before allowing a careful pat on his head. Some watchers murmured in surprise at the direwolf's acceptance of the queen. Over the following days, Sansa hosted a series of feasts and gatherings in Winterfell's Great Hall to celebrate the royal visit. The hall was cozy with roaring hearth fires, the old banners overhead stirring in the drafts. Northern lords who had once been suspicious of Daenerys found themselves seated near her, sharing cups of mead and stories of the war. She listened with genuine interest, describing in turn how King's Landing was rebuilding, how the new council operated. Bit by bit, the North softened. Jon's presence helped immensely. He was a constant reminder that while Daenerys might be from the South, she was married to a Stark of Winterfell, a man whose loyalty to the North was unquestioned. One evening, as the feasting lulled, Daenerys slipped away to walk the ramparts. The northern sky glimmered with stars far clearer than the hazy glow of King's Landing. She wore a thick fur cloak, breath misting in the cold air. Below, she could see the castle courtyard, lit by torches. She could hear the laughter from the hall, men and women relaxing after so many years of war. She felt a hand on her shoulder and turned to find Jon. He too gazed at the stars, a faint smile on his face. "It's strange," she murmured, drawing the cloak tighter. "I remember first coming here, how cold it was, how uncertain everything felt. Now it almost feels comforting." Jon nodded, looking over the battlements. "This was the only home I ever knew, and yet so much has changed." He paused, then glanced at her. "Do you ever miss the times before you ruled? When it was just you, your dragons, and a handful of people you trusted?" She considered that, exhaling softly. "Sometimes, life was simpler though always dangerous. Yet I was free to move, to conquer. Now I have a throne. 2 thrones, perhaps, and responsibilities I never imagined." She let out a small laugh. "I used to think I wanted that more than anything. Now I see it's less about what I want, and more about what the people need." He brushed a lock of silver hair from her face. "That's why you're a good queen," he said simply. "Not because you crave power, but because you want to do right by the people, even if it weighs on you." They stood that way for a while, side by side, quietly watching the northern sky. A few stray snowflakes drifted past, heralds of a late spring flurry. The next day, they departed Winterfell and ventured to the nearby villages, speaking with farmers, hearing concerns about replanting fields ravaged by the undead. Daenerys promised aid where possible, forging direct bonds that wove the North ever closer to the new monarchy. By the time they prepared to return south, it was clear that while some Northerners would always be leery of Southern rule, most had accepted the Queen as part of House Stark's extended family. It was far more than they had hoped for just a year prior, when Daenerys' arrival in the North had stirred such fear. Riding south once again, Jon and Daenerys reflected on the realm's progress. They spoke of next steps: completing reconstruction in King's Landing, stabilizing trade across the narrower seas, continuing to root out any criminals or remnants of the old wars. Daenerys also confided in Jon her thoughts about the Iron Throne, still looming in the Red Keep, still untouched by her. She had begun leaning more strongly toward the idea of destroying it, forging the melted steel into new swords for the City Watch or tools to build the realm. Yet she hesitated, well aware of the symbolism. Jon, for his part, supported whatever she chose, reminding her that the people cared more about her deeds than which seat she occupied. When they arrived in King's Landing, they found the city calmer than ever. Tyrion greeted them with a wry smile, reporting that the new council had functioned relatively smoothly in their absence. Varys, lurking by a pillar, nodded his agreement. Grey Worm described how the City Watch had taken over more responsibilities from the Unsullied, allowing some of his men to enjoy a measure of rest and even the beginnings of a life outside constant warfare. Indeed, A number of Unsullied had chosen to remain near the sea. Dreamers of the day they might sail to Noth to keep Missandei's home safe. But for now, they upheld their vows to the queen who had freed them, forging a disciplined core of King's Landing's defense. Daenerys resumed her daily routine of petitions, audiences, and council sessions. Jon, meanwhile, worked with Davos and Gendry to expand the city's port facilities, ensuring smoother commerce and stable docking for visiting ships. The city streets were no longer a maze of rubble, though some buildings still bore blackened walls from the siege. The reek of open sewers lessened as Tyrion's new drainage projects took shape. Life thrived in the markets, where hawkers of produce, spices, and cloth jostled for customers. The tension of fear that once gripped the capital had, if not disappeared, at least receded to a dull undercurrent. People worried about the price of wheat more than the threat of dragonfire. In private, Daenerys finally resolved to address the fate of the Iron Throne. Late one evening, with only a few lanterns lit, she walked to the throne room, flanked by Jon. Grey Worm stationed guards at the doors to ensure privacy. The massive seat of fused swords still loomed in the distance, columns of the hall casting shadows across it. Dust motes swirled in the lantern light. Daenerys approached the throne slowly, recalling how she had once been dazzled by the idea of sitting upon it, how it symbolized her family's legacy and the culmination of her quest. She reached out, fingertips brushing the cold metal. In the hush, she thought she could almost hear the echoes of her father's laughter, of the swords that had been hammered into this shape by dragonfire long ago. Jon stood beside her, silent, letting her gather her thoughts. She ran a hand along the jagged edge of a sword hilt, feeling how easily it could cut flesh if one were careless. A memory stirred of the countless men who had died for this throne, of those who had killed for it, who had betrayed loved ones, who had sparked wars that left the countryside strewn with corpses. All for a seat, all for power that was, in the end, fleeting. She closed her eyes. "I came here wanting this more than anything," she whispered, voice wavering. "I thought my right to this throne would heal the wounds of my past. But the truth is, the throne is nothing but a chair if the people who kneel before it have no hope, no faith, no freedom. We have spent the last months proving that we can lead without fear. This symbol, maybe it's time to let it go." Jon watched her, his expression solemn. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. "You don't have to do this." She opened her eyes, meeting his gaze. "I am. I will not define my rule by this relic of blood. My authority comes from the trust we've built, not from melted swords." She studied his face. "But I want you with me in case—" She trailed off, not quite able to name her lingering fear. Perhaps the fear that by giving up this symbol, she might unravel the realm's fragile acceptance. Jon placed a hand over hers on the metal. "I'm with you. Always." That night, they summoned a handful of trusted blacksmiths, Gendry among them, along with Tyrion, Grey Worm, and Varys. Under Daenerys' direct order, the blacksmiths carefully constructed a network of coal pits around the Iron Throne. Dragonstone coal was brought, stoked hot until it glowed. Then, with the hall's great doors barred, Daenerys summoned Drogon. The massive dragon, now accustomed to being called upon for tasks other than war, perched outside the broken dome overhead, letting his enormous head peer down through a gap. When Daenerys gave the signal in High Valyrian, Drogon exhaled a jet of fire that ignited the coal pits around the throne, turning the entire dais into a blazing crucible. The blacksmiths stood at a cautious distance, cloths over their mouths to avoid inhaling the fumes. Jon, Tyrion, and the others watched in silent awe as the metal began to glow. The Iron Throne, for centuries a symbol of Targaryen conquest, started to soften under the relentless heat. Edges dripped molten steel. Sword hilts lost their shape, twisting and sagging. Drogon roared once more, unleashing a final burst of flame that engulfed the throne in a searing blaze. Daenerys stood near the edge of the dais, face illuminated by the inferno, tears glistening in her eyes. She felt the enormity of the moment, the final end of her family's triumphant relic. At last, the roar of the flames receded. Drogon withdrew, smoke curling from his nostrils, wings beating the night air outside. In the center of the dais lay a mass of molten metal, dull red in the low light. It hissed and crackled as the blacksmiths cautiously approached with tools to manipulate the shape, funneling it into molds. Gendry, face streaked with sweat, oversaw the process. Over many hours, the molten remains of the Iron Throne were formed into ingots. Daenerys had instructed them to keep some portion aside to forge new swords for the City Watch, new tools for farmers. The rest would be stored for possible future use, building rather than destroying. When it was done, the dais stood empty, scorched black but free of the twisted steel that had claimed so many lives. Daenerys felt a mingled sense of loss and liberation, as if she had finally closed a chapter of history that defined her family. The hush among those present was profound. Tyrion watched the last embers fade, face unreadable. Grey Worm's gaze flicked from the molten metal to the queen, as though searching for some reflection of her emotions. Varys maintained his perpetual calm, though his eyes shone with an unusual intensity. Jon stepped closer to Daenerys, resting a hand on her shoulder. "It's done," he said quietly, almost a question. She nodded. "It is." She turned to the blacksmiths. "Thank you for your labor. You will be compensated well. Take care with the metal. It's dangerous while hot." They bowed, stepping back. Tyrion cleared his throat softly. "Your Grace, this is a moment that will echo through the ages. How do you wish to announce it?" Daenerys took a moment before answering. "We'll tell the people the truth, that we destroyed the throne forged by Aegon the Conqueror, so that no more wars would be fought for a chair. That we choose to rule by counsel and consent, not by the threat of centuries-old swords. Let them know this is the dawn of a new era." Tyrion inclined his head. "As you wish. I'll draft the proclamation," Varys murmured. "There will be those who claim you disrespected your ancestors." Daenerys exhaled, a wry half-smile tugging at her lips. "Let them talk. My ancestors are gone. The living are here. I serve them." Grey Worm said nothing, but there was a hint of approval in his steady gaze. He was a man who had seen too many leaders claim authority through brutality. If Daenerys truly meant to break the wheel, then perhaps this final act would ensure no one resurrected it with the Iron Throne's image. In the days that followed, news of the throne's destruction rippled through King's Landing and beyond. Reactions were mixed: shock, disbelief, astonishment. Some older lords were furious, calling it sacrilege. Others hailed it as the definitive end to the old cycle of power. The small folk, for their part, were impressed by the statement. A queen who melted down the most coveted seat in Westeros because she believed in a different way of ruling. For many, that was enough to reinforce their cautious trust in her reign. While the city buzzed with this development, Daenerys quietly continued her duties. If no throne of swords remained, she still had the simpler seat on which she received petitioners each day. She attended the Grand Council sessions, navigated disputes, and oversaw reconstruction. Jon took an active role in strengthening the City Watch, forging new swords from the melted steel. In the end, a good portion of the metal was diverted to forging tools, plowshares, shovels, picks. Gendry oversaw that distribution, ensuring it reached needy villages and farmland. The symbolic act was not lost on the populace. The swords that had once threatened them were now harnessed to feed and rebuild. Seasons turned. The first real spring in years blossomed across the realm. The scars of war remained, but fields grew green, flowers sprang up in once barren meadows, and trade routes thrived with caravans heading north and south, east and west. Daenerys and Jon often rode out on horseback to see the progress for themselves, accompanied by a retinue of loyal guards. Drogon and Rhaegal patrolled the skies less frequently now, content to roost in a secure enclosure near the city, or hunt in the surrounding countryside as they pleased. The realm finally exhaled. If any doubted that this new monarchy was real, the forging of fresh alliances soon sealed it. In the Riverlands, Edmure Tully held a grand harvest festival to which Daenerys and Jon were invited. They attended, surprising many of the local lords who had never seen a Targaryen up close. Daenerys danced with Jon under the mild autumn sky, the music of fiddles and drums echoing along the trident. She found herself laughing more freely than she had in years, not worried about enemies lurking at every turn. Jon's step was awkward. He'd never been much of a dancer, but she guided him gently. The River Lords, seeing their closeness, found it difficult to believe the old rumors that she was a tyrant waiting to burn them all. The festival ended with a vibrant display of casks tapped for ale and wine, toasting a future that might actually hold peace. Further west, Laurent Lannister rebuilt some measure of Lannister pride, focusing on fair trade and the revival of gold mines in a manner that did not exploit small folk. He visited King's Landing to show progress. Tyrion, simultaneously proud and cautious, welcomed him, forging a fragile sense of family that had been lost long ago. Yara Greyjoy wrote to Daenerys, describing how the Iron Islands had flourished by devoting themselves to trade rather than reaving, though some old captains still clung to the ways of raiding. She might well stamp it out entirely in time, she claimed, especially if the monarchy continued to support her legitimacy. Daenerys replied with gratitude and encouragement, promising that if the Ironborn truly adapted, they would find themselves valued in the new realm as skilled sailors and navigators. In King's Landing, the final touches on the city's reconstruction were completed. New spires rose where old ones had collapsed. Bridges were reinforced, sewers cleared, markets refurbished. A fresh sense of identity took hold. No longer the decadent seat of a paranoid court, but a more open, if still sprawling, metropolis where men and women from every corner of Westeros could converge. The Dragon Pit, once a ruin, was partially restored as a site for the dragons, though Daenerys saw to it that they were not chained, merely housed when needed, allowed to come and go freely. All of these efforts came to a head in the form of a grand celebration marking 2 full years since the end of the war. The city prepared festivities like none had seen in a generation. Bright pennants fluttered from tall poles. The streets thronged with vendors selling spice treats and cool refreshments. Musicians from Dorne, the North, the Reach, and even Essos converged, their melodies blending into a rich tapestry of sound. Jesters, jugglers, and mummers performed in open squares, entertaining children who squealed with delight. Where once fear reigned, now laughter prevailed. It was not perfection. Thievery and fights still happened. The scars of poverty remained. But for a few days, the realm reveled in the absence of war. Daenerys and Jon presided over the festival, riding together in a ceremonial parade through the city's main thoroughfare. Grey Worm and his Unsullied formed an honor guard, their ranks joined by northern soldiers, men of the City Watch, and even a small detachment from Dorne. People crowded to catch a glimpse of the queen and her consort. Daenerys wore a flowing gown of pale blue, embroidered with subtle dragon motifs. Jon wore black and gray with silver accents. Atop their horses, they waved to the cheering crowds. The ovation was genuine, full of gratitude for the end of tyranny and the birth of some new order. Men threw flower petals, children scrambled to pick them up, and the air rang with the calls of hawkers selling sweet buns. At the apex of the festival, Daenerys took the dais in the refurbished royal square. She spoke of unity, of the journey they had taken from the darkest night at Winterfell to the dawn of reconstruction. She called upon the memory of those who had perished, the valiant defenders of the North, the innocents of King's Landing, the many souls lost to the undead. Her voice wavered momentarily as she named Jorah Mormont, the Dothraki, the Unsullied who had shed blood for her cause. Then she steadied herself. "We have come far," she declared, her words echoing through the hush that fell over the crowd. "And our work continues. But if we stand together, we can break the cycles that have haunted us for centuries. Today we feast, and tomorrow we build. Together." The crowd roared its approval. Jon stepped forward, placing a supportive hand on her back. They exchanged a look, a shared pride in what they had achieved, tempered by the memory of the battles that had made it possible. In that moment, beneath the golden sunlight and the swirl of cheering people, it felt like the realm had truly turned a page. Night fell, the city alight with torches and lanterns. Musicians played across every square, and wine flowed freely. High above, Drogon and Regal soared in lazy circles, their roars echoing across the rooftops like distant thunder, a reminder of the might that still guarded the realm. Fireworks purchased from Pentos shimmered in the sky, brilliant blossoms of red, gold, and green. And in a quiet corner of the Red Keep's gardens, Daenerys and Jon slipped away from a revelry for a moment's solitude. The air was mild, the scent of night-blooming flowers drifting on the breeze. Jon took her hand and spun her gently under the soft light of a lantern, an impromptu dance away from the crowds. Daenerys laughed, letting herself savor the moment. It felt worlds removed from the day they had fought the dead at Winterfell, from the day they had confronted Cersei at the city gates, from the day they had melted the Iron Throne. All those trials had led here, to this ephemeral night of peace and promise. When the last of the fireworks faded, Daenerys glanced up at the sky. Stars twinkled where smoke hadn't obscured them. She leaned against Jon's chest and let out a soft breath. "I never truly believed it could feel like this," she murmured. "That we could stand here, not as conquerors or avengers, but as stewards of something better." He pressed a light kiss to her temple. "We earned it every step of the way, and tomorrow we keep working to make sure it lasts." Her eyes shone with unshed tears, the emotion of the moment overwhelming. She turned to face him fully, brushing her lips against his in a gentle kiss. His arms enclosed her, and they stood there beneath the moonlight, the hush of the city's distant celebrations cradling them. For once, the ghosts of the past seemed at rest, and the future lay open, challenging, yes, but shaped by their hopes and actions, not by the iron dictates of an old throne. In the time that followed, historians and poets would look back on this period as the start of the Targaryen Stark Reformation, or the Age of Shared Crowns. They would argue about how permanent these changes were, whether Daenerys' destruction of the Iron Throne truly banished the specter of absolute monarchs, whether the Grand Council was as democratic as some claimed or still too dominated by powerful families. But in the living, breathing present, the realm's people knew a stability they had not felt in years, even decades. And all because Daenerys Targaryen and Jon Snow had chosen to unite, not just in marriage but in purpose after the Battle of Winterfell. They had made that choice to prevent further bloodshed, to secure their claims before ambition and fear tore them apart. Along the way, they had faced betrayals, battles, and a near descent into tyranny. Yet each time, they chose a path that led toward compassion, compromise, and unity. The final reward was not a single moment of triumphant victory, but the slow, steady revival of a realm that could dream again. Farmers tending fields without fear of raiders, children growing up with full bellies, merchants trading from the Arbor to White Harbor, knights living by a code that protected the innocent rather than oppressing them. And so, in the quiet hush that followed the festival's end, in the flicker of torches across the city's walls, Daenerys and Jon found themselves back in their shared chambers. She sat by the window, gazing out at the star-freckled sky. He approached with 2 cups of mellow wine, offering her one. She took it, smiling in gratitude. They clinked their cups gently, a private toast. "To the realm," Jon said simply, eyes reflecting both fatigue and contentment. Daenerys nodded. "To the realm, and to the promise that we'll guard it, come what may." They drank, letting the wine's warmth settle in. Outside, the faint roar of Drogon drifted across the night, echoed by the quieter rumble of Regal. Daenerys closed her eyes for a moment, feeling Jon's arm slip around her shoulders. The sweet hush of possibility filled her heart. Perhaps their hardships were not over. Perhaps new threats lurked beyond the horizon. But for this night, at least, they had forged a peace that was real, and in that peace, they could finally breathe. She turned her head and pressed her lips softly to Jon's, a gentle affirmation of all they had won and all they still hoped to achieve. As they rested in each other's arms, the city dozed beneath them, exhausted from celebration but brimming with unspoken faith in tomorrow. The wheel was not just broken, it was being reshaped into something that might endure. And high above, in the clear night sky, the stars bore silent witness to the dawn of an era that might truly be better than the last.